It was funny, because by the time we got near his house, we forgot where we were going. We were in this Cadillac limousine. And you know what it's like in LA, everything goes round and round and round and round, and then I think we're going along Mulholland.
Who is the hippie that's happening all over our town? Gathering up the chicks with a message that he lays down.
Oh, we had a couple of cups of tea in the back of the car. We pulled up and there was these big gates, and somebody said, "Oh yeah, we're going to see Elvis." And then we all fell out, just like in a Beatle cartoon. We all fell out the car, all in hysterics, trying to pretend we weren't silly.
As the Beatles' plane touched down in Los Angeles on a hazy August day in 1965, they were ready for a much-needed break from the screams, from the chaos, and from the weight of their own fame. Brian Epstein arranged for a short retreat, renting Zsa Zsa Gabor's secluded home at 2850 Benedict Canyon Road. The single-story estate tucked away in the hills became a temporary sanctuary where the band could rest, explore, and for some, experiment. Just 2 days into their week-long stay, madness sparks a breakthrough. George Harrison and John Lennon were revisiting a mind-bending experience, by choice this time, that had already begun to alter their perceptions. Ringo Starr, curious, decided to join them. Paul McCartney declined, choosing to remain an observer at this point. George said of the moment, "I thought, Jesus, I remember. I was trying to play the guitar, and then I got in the swimming pool, and it was a great feeling. The water felt so good." That day, the house buzzed with visitors. Eleanor Braun, who had starred alongside them in Help, stopped by, as did Peter Fonda, Roger McGuinn, and David Crosby of the Byrds, along with journalist Don Short of the Daily Mirror. The atmosphere was part social gathering, part surreal experience. Guitars were passed around, songs played, and conversations drifted from light to existential. Peter Fonda told Rolling Stone, "Paul and George were on the back patio, and the helicopters were patrolling overhead. They were sitting at a table under an umbrella in a rather comical attempt at privacy. Soon afterwards, we began to hallucinate for what would prove to be all night and most of the next day. All of us, including the original Byrds, eventually ended up inside a huge, empty, and sunken tub in the bathroom, babbling our minds away." I had the privilege of listening to the four of them sing, play around, and scheme about what they would compose and achieve. They were so enthusiastic, so full of fun. John was the wittiest and most astute. I enjoyed just hearing him speak, and there were no pretensions in his manner. He just sat around laying out the lines of poetry and thinking. An amazing mind. He talked a lot, yet he still seemed so private.
Whilst all the tower was sleepy, crept a little boy from bed, to feign the wondrous people what lived when they were dead. He packed a little voucher for his dinner neath a tree. Perhaps a tiny dwarf or two would share a bite with me.
Do you think that you'd be published were you not a Beatle?
I could probably get published, but, I wouldn't sell as many. I mean, they publish a lot of rubbish anyway, but I wouldn't sell.
Do you think you've got a built-in advantage in being a Beatle? I mean, are you glad about this, or would you rather have earned a reputation as a writer in your own right?
No, I never thought of it. If I hadn't been a Beatle, I just wouldn't have thought of having the stuff published, because I would have been crawling around broke and just writing it and throwing it away. Might have been a beat poet.
How did it come about that you weren't a beat poet and that your first book was published?
Well, some American who shall remain nameless was called Michael Brown. I showed him the stuff and he took it to the publisher and they published it. That was it.
Roger McGuinn shares his memories of the night. There were girls at the gates, police guards. We went in and David, John Lennon, George Harrison, and I took it to help get to know each other better. There was a large bathroom in the house, and we were all sitting on the edge of a shower, passing around a guitar, taking turns to play our favorite songs. John and I agreed Bebop-A-Lula was our favorite 50s rock record. For George, his time with Roger and David planted an unexpected seed that would go on to change everything for him, and one that would soon blossom in the Beatles' music. I showed George Harrison some Ravi Shankar sounds on the guitar, which I'd heard because we shared the same record company. I told him about Ravi Shankar, and he said he'd never heard Indian music before, McGuinn remembers. Indian music and psychedelics soon influenced their studio experimentation. George learned to play the sitar, adding it to Norwegian Wood later that year. Harrison later said that the process had been quite spontaneous from what I remember. We mic'd it up and put it on, and it just seemed to hit the spot. As the day went on, the distance from reality grew. Peter Fonda tried to offer comfort when George became overwhelmed by the intensity of the moment and thought he was dying. Fonda recalls, "I told him there was nothing to be afraid of and all he needed to do was relax. I said I knew what it was like to be dead because when I was 10 years old, I accidentally shot myself in the stomach and my heart stopped beating 3 times while I was on the operating table because I'd lost so much blood." John was passing at the time and heard me saying, "I know what it's like to be dead." He looked at me and said, "You're making me feel like I've never been born." Lennon urged him to drop the subject, saying, "Who put all that in your head?" Harrison recalls in the Beatles anthology, "Fonda was showing us his bullet wound. He was very uncool." John Lennon recalls the experience. Peter Fonda came, and that was another thing. He kept on saying, "I know what it's like to be dead." We said, "What?" And he kept saying it, and we were saying, "For Christ's sake, shut up. We don't care. We don't want to know." But he kept going on about it. That's how I wrote She Said, She Said. I know what it's like to be dead. We still didn't know anything about doing it in a nice place and cool it and all that. We just took it, Lennon recalled. And all of a sudden we saw the reporter and we're thinking, how do we act normal? Because we imagined we were acting extraordinary, which we weren't. We thought surely somebody can see. We were terrified waiting for him to go. Neil Aspinall, their road manager, had unexpectedly joined in and was now struggling to maintain order. Don Short, the journalist, couldn't understand why he was being kept at a distance. And then there was Fonda, still talking. Lennon explained the situation further in a 1980 interview. "We didn't want to hear about that. We were on a trip and the sun was shining and the girls were dancing and the whole thing was beautiful and 60s. And this guy, who I really didn't know, he hadn't made Easy Rider or anything, kept coming over, wearing shades, saying, 'I know what it's like to be dead.' And we kept leaving him because he was so boring. It was scary, you know, when you're flying high and he whispers, 'I know what it's like to be dead, man.'" Lennon eventually asked Fonda to leave the party. As the sun set over Benedict Canyon, the band sat with uneaten food in front of them, trying to appear composed while most of their minds were anything but. Paul felt very out of it because we were a bit cruel. It's like, we're taking it and you're not. We couldn't eat our food. I just couldn't manage it. Picking it up with hands, and there's all these people serving us in the house, and we're just knocking it on the floor. Oh, like that. Peter Brown, Epstein's assistant, later wrote that in addition to inspiring Lennon's 1966 song, She Said, She Said, the band members' experiment in August 65 marked the unheralded beginning of a new era for the Beatles. George Case declared in his book, Out of Our Heads, that the Beatles' subsequent album, Rubber Soul, and its 1966 follow-up, Revolver, were the authentic beginning of the psychedelic era. The gathering had become surreal, even unsettling. The Beatles were new to this sort of boundary pushing, still learning that environment and mindset that could shape such experiences, for better or worse. There were stretches of joy, confusion, paranoia, and even absurdity. But one moment will become much more meaningful later on than you might notice at first. It was a single strange day in Los Angeles, but the ripples from it would show up everywhere, from the shimmering sitar on Norwegian Wood to the Beatles' psychedelic songs to follow. Something had shifted in their music and in themselves, and it started on a hazy day in the hills of LA, with guitars in hand and reality just slightly out of reach.
A big change happened in 1966, particularly to John and myself. Now, people who've taken that will know what I'm talking about, and anybody who hasn't taken it won't have a clue, because it transforms you. After that, I didn't need it ever again. You don't need it twice.
You've only taken it once?
Oh, no, I took it lots of times. But I only needed it once.
On the Beatles' 5th day of the trip, they went on the infamous meeting with Elvis. It took place at Presley's mansion at 525 Perugia Way, Bel Air.
One trip or another, we met Elvis. It was one of the highlights of our visit.
The Beatles arrived around 11 p.m. and were greeted by Elvis in his large circular living room. The room was bathed in red and blue light and contained a color television, jukebox, crescent-shaped couch, game tables, and a bar. George describes the drive over.
Oh, we had a couple of cups of tea in the back of the car, and by the time we got to Elvis's house, we forgot where we were going. It didn't really matter where we were going.
Bel Air, actually. And, this meet was arranged. We were going to go and see him.
John remembers their impression of his house. It was very exciting. We were all nervous as hell, and we met him in his big house in LA. Probably as big as the one we were staying in, but it felt like big house, big Elvis. He had lots of guys around him, all these guys that used to live near him, like we did from Liverpool. We always had thousands of Liverpool people around us, so I guess he was the same. And he had pool tables. Maybe a lot of American houses are like that, but it seemed amazing to us. It was like a nightclub. After chatting and playing music for several hours, the Beatles left. Paul McCartney describes the encounter.
It was great. It was great. It was one of the great meetings of my life.
I only met him that once, and I think that the success of our career started to push him out a little, which we were very sad about because we wanted to coexist with him. He was our greatest idol, but the styles were changing in favor of us. He was a pretty powerful image to the British people.
I mean, the saddest part is now, years and years later, we found out that he tried to have us banished from America because he was very big with the CIA and everything, and that he felt so threatened, that he thought, like a lot of people, that we were bad for the American youth.
Well, you ain't never caught a rabbit. You ain't no friend of mine.
When I first met George, I was dating Mama Cass's sister, and she was staying at Cass's. We heard George was coming over to visit Cass, and we looked at each other, and Cass said, "Stay away." We said, "Yeah," as if, not bloody likely. I'd already been cast for the Monkees television show, but we hadn't started production yet, so I got to say hi to him. Later on, when the Monkees played in England in the summer of '67, the Beatles had a party at a club, and we arranged to meet them. George was kind enough to invite me and my pal Bill Chadwick out to his house and take us to visit Ringo later that day. He was as kind and as gentle of a man as you could imagine. Peter Tork tells the Liverpool Echo in November 2011. Then in August 1967, George and Patty Harrison, along with Neil Aspinall and Alexis Magic Alex, flew from London to Los Angeles. They stayed at a house at 1567 Blue Jay Way in the Hollywood Hills, an area adjacent to Laurel Canyon. While waiting for publicist Derek Taylor to arrive, George, jet-lagged and inspired by the foggy atmosphere, composed an eerie song. George describes the night. Derek Taylor got held up. He rang to say he'd be late. I told him on the phone that the house was in Blue Jay Way, and he said he could find it okay. He could always ask a cop. So I waited and waited. I felt really knackered with the flight, but I didn't want to go to sleep until he came. There was a fog, and it got later and later. To keep myself awake, just as a joke to pass time while I waited, I wrote a song about waiting for him in Blue Jay Way. There was a little Hammond organ in the corner of the house, which I hadn't noticed until then, so I messed around on it, and the song came. Patty recalled in her book Wonderful Tonight hanging out with Joni Mitchell, who came to take her out while Harrison was working. She also detailed a day out at Peter Tork's house. One day, David Crosby invited us to his place in the hills. We arrived to find a swimming pool full of naked people, Boyd wrote. Not knowing anyone, or indeed what to do, we went into the house until David arrived, naked with a joint in his hand. He soon realized we weren't going to join in and put on his shorts. At one point, a pool cleaner arrived and didn't bat an eyelid. He just got on with the job. LA is wild, I thought. George spoke of that trip to California. We went to America in August, a couple months after the Monterey Pop Festival. My sister-in-law at the time, Jenny Boyd, who was Jennifer Juniper in the Donovan song, had been living in San Francisco. She decided that she wanted to come back to live in England. We all went for a day out to see her, Derek and Neil and the not-so-magic Alex, and myself and Patty. After they leave Los Angeles, they fly to San Francisco to visit Haight-Ashbury, and that is when George has an epiphany. Patty Boyd describes some of the events of the trip in her book Wonderful Tonight that led up to George's moment of clarity. We went into a shop and noticed that all these people were following us. They had recognized George as we walked past them in the street and then turned to follow us. One minute there were 5, then 10, 20, 30, and 40 people behind us. I could hear them saying, "The Beatles are here. The Beatles are in town." We were expecting Haight-Ashbury to be special, a creative and artistic place filled with beautiful people, but it was horrible, full of ghastly dropouts, bums, and spotty youths, all out of their brains. Everybody looked even mothers and babies, and they were so close behind us they were treading on the backs of our heels. It got to the point where we couldn't stop for fear of being trampled. Then somebody said, "Let's go to Hippie Hill." They looked at us expectantly, as if George were some kind of messiah. And then the inevitable happened. A guitar emerged from the crowd, and I could see it being passed to the front by outreached arms. I thought, oh God, poor George, this is a nightmare. Finally, the guitar was handed to him. I had the feeling they'd been listening to the Beatles records, analyzed them, learned what they thought they should learn, and then taken every they thought the Beatles were singing about. Now they wanted to know where to go next, and George was there, obviously to give them the answer. Pressure. George was so cool. He said, "This is G, this is E, and this is D," and then showed them a few chords, then handed back the guitar and said, "Sorry, man, we've got to go now." He didn't sing. He couldn't have. We were flying. We all were. I was surprised he could even do that. Anyway, we got up, walked back towards our limo, at which point I heard a little voice say, "Hey, George, do you want some?" George turned around and said, "No thanks, I'm cool, man." Then the bloke turned around and said to the others, "George Harrison turned me down." And they went, "No." And then the crowd became faintly hostile. We sensed it because when you're very aware of vibes. And we were walking faster and faster, and they were following. When we saw the limo, we ran across the road and jumped in, and they ran after us and started to rock the car, and the windows full of these faces flattened against the glass looking at us. That was a turning point for George. What we saw at Haight-Ashbury was an eye-opener. There was nothing remotely artistic or creative about these people. They were like alcoholics or any other kind of addict, and it turned George off to the whole culture. He stopped taking and took up meditation. Then on a trip to Los Angeles in 1968, George and Ringo came to hang out at Peter Tork's house and to jam. Peter tells Rolling Stone, "Yeah, they did, with Steve Stills. Steve was there and he was embarrassed. He shook hands with George and kind of turned his back on him, the way shy guys will do. We all jammed. Steven and George and Ringo and I were on keyboards. I don't remember who played bass. It was fabulous to hear Ringo play. My God, what a drummer. God, he was good. He was so solid, and the authority was astounding. I learned so much just by playing with him for 5 minutes. It was a wonderful experience." Mal Evans also describes the event to Beatles Monthly in August 68. "First social call was to Peter Tork's house. When we arrived, Peter was wearing a string of beads and very little else, since it was far too hot to be anywhere but a swimming pool that day. Dave Crosby of the Byrds was there too, and we had a good get-together. I suppose the highlight of LA this time for us was the session we had at Peter Tork's place. Peter Asher joined us there. He played bass. Peter Tork was on piano. George and David Crosby were on guitars, and Ringo was drumming." Throughout the 70s, George was often in Los Angeles, sometimes for music, sometimes for friendships. He laid down slide guitar tracks for Dave Mason, worked on Ravi Shankar's Raga soundtrack, and spent time at A&M Studios. He crossed paths with Crosby, Stills, Nash, and Frank Zappa, but he never quite bought into the LA lifestyle. George was searching for something else, and he once said the LA scene felt spiritually empty. But ironically, it's where he first discovered spiritual inspiration when introduced to Ravi Shankar's music, and later, peace.
Fame is not the goal. Money, although money's nice to have, it can buy you a bit of freedom. You can go to the Bahamas when you want, but it's not the answer. And the answer, is how to get peace of mind and how to be happy. That's really what we're supposed to be here for. And the difficult thing is that we all go through our lives and through our days and we don't experience bliss. And, it's a very subtle thing. And to experience that and to be able to know how to do that is something you don't just stumble across. You've got to search for it.
I think everyone can relate to George's search for something more, which may be why he has remained such a magnetic character all these years. The man who had everything was in search of something much deeper that money could not provide. In the final year of his life, George Harrison quietly returned to Los Angeles. He stayed at a friend's house on Laurel Canyon Boulevard, just a mere 4 miles from the Benedict Canyon home, where 30 years earlier he thought he was dying. And just a few miles from the home, he wrote an eerie Beatles song as fog engulfed the city. This time there was no wild party, just reflection and silence, and hopefully the beginning of the spiritual life he was always in search of.